And Mike, you're all set.
Okay, good morning and welcome. I would like to call the meeting of the Policy and the Personnel Committee to order. It is 9:02 a.m. Stephanie, would you please take the roll call?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Ava Bermuda Zimmerman has not joined us yet. Ellen McKitterick,
Present.
Alice Pritchard,
Present.
David Salazar,
Present.
Mike Soltis,
Present.
and Holly Williams will not be joining us. We have a quorum.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Would also like to welcome the members of the public who have joined us today. First item on the agenda is a review and approval of the minutes of the May 7, 2024 meeting. May I have a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved. Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you. Next item is a discussion concerning the contribution rate policy. Michael, good morning. Can you lead us on a discussion of that policy?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. And good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Can folks see a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
So just to sort of level set, this is the discussion about the language of the policy regarding the annual review of the contribution rate for the program. If the committee remembers last meeting, we had talked about a few options for a policy. Option one being we do nothing as far as a policy. We just sort of let the statute speak for itself. As far as the rate setting process, option two was we have a more robust, maybe strictly defined policy that includes potentially the formula that's used and potentially could end up binding the board's hands as far as what the rate would be any given year. And then option three is sort of a middle ground between those two, where we would have a policy that sort of spoke to the factors to consider, as well as provide some a bit of the timeline for the review process each year. But wouldn't necessarily bind the board's hand beyond what's already in the statute. So we did draft a version of that we had shared with the committee folks. And just to sort of further level set, this is what we had shared previously with I believe the full board. Considerations regarding the rate calculation. Sort of just going through this quickly because I think that most people have seen it already, but 7 states of the 15 have a more specific, explicit formula that they use for the rate each year. But that means 8 of them, more than half of them, do not, including Connecticut. The current rate cap of 0.5% that we have, obviously that impacts us in a couple of ways. One, the rate setting can't be above 0.5%, but also because it's the lowest cap compared to all other states, we have less flexibility to catch up if we do have a need for additional contributions. So that does limit us compared with other states that have, over 1% that they can potentially adjust their rate to. We did want to make sure we considered current and future fund balance, particularly around the timing of contributions, which tends to happen on a quarterly basis, where most people provide their contributions at the end of the quarter, and also where the first quarter ends up having a larger contribution amount than the fourth quarter due to the Social Security cap that limits contributions for employees. We also want to make sure we consider the long-term impact, not just the current year or maybe even the next year, but looking 10 years into the future for setting that rate. And then we also wanted to make sure we anticipated, this is sort of a weird phrase, anticipated the unanticipated, the known unknowns, if you will. Things like economic downturns, high unemployment, health events, things that have happened rarely, but also twice in the past 20 years. And then finally, the statute asks the board to consider minimizing the rate changes each year so that it's not a different rate every single year if it can be avoided. I'm also going to turn it over to Dave for a little more detail about the rate itself and the calculation formula. Dave, are you good to go?
Yes, I am. Okay, so on this page, there's the elements, and this is pretty much what Mike had talked about before regarding the components. We want to emphasize this is a long-term view where we're using 10 years out, and that's because we want to allow for long-term trends. Because if you look at too short of a view, like only 1 year, you may mask a trend that you see in the long term. So that's why we want to do that. The fund balance at the end of the 10 years, again, we're looking at a long-term view and starting with the current fund balance and then looking at the net activity over the next 10 years. And as Michael said, we really want to try and make sure we have enough money for the known unknowns. In other words, a contingency reserve. So what is that reserve? And that reserve is two things. It's one on the number one, on the contribution side, it's what if the contributions went down by 10% over the 3 years? And then also on the benefits side, what if benefits and the related operating expenses went up by 25%? So we want to make sure that we have enough money in the fund for it to be solvent, so that in the unlikely event that those things happen, that the fund is still around and can pay out full benefits. And then ultimately, this exercise is to determine what the minimum contribution level should be over that 10-year period. So we can cover program costs, the benefits paid, and like I said, so the fund is around to fight another day. So if we can go to the next page. So now, admittedly, this will be deja vu for those of you who are on the finance committee. Some of the numbers have changed slightly because we updated them for recent data, but the trend is still the same. So we start off at the beginning. In other words, the current fund balance, or at least at the end of this current fiscal year 2024, where we'll think we'll be. And then we add or subtract to that what we think the activity will be in the next 10 years. And that's letter B. And so that's contributions and investment income coming in and benefit payments and other expenses going out. And so where we start at a current fund balance at about $633 million, with the help of our actuaries, we're estimating that the net activity over the next 10 years will be $435 million. So at the end of the 10 years, you get to letter C, which is A plus B, and you get over $1 billion. And that's where we think the fund balance will be at the 10-year period. So the next step is letter D. How much do we need in the fund to cover for those known unknowns? And that's what I talked about before. Contributions going down by 10% over 3 years, and benefits and expenses going up by 25% over 3 years. And so again, with the help of our actuaries, we've estimated the effect of that to be almost $694 million. So if you compare the two numbers, C to D, the difference is almost $375 million. That means theoretically that the fund would have $375 million more than it would need for a contingency at the end of the 10 years. Okay, so what do you do with that number to determine the contribution rate? You take that $375 million and you divide that by the anticipated contributions that are up above. It's the second number from the bottom of I got to get this right, $5,673 million. And what's the percentage of that? The percentage of that is letter F, is 7%. So that means we could reduce the contribution rate by 7% and still have enough to get to the target fund balance in 10 years. The current rate, as you all probably know, is 0.5%. if we reduce it by 7%, or in other words, take 93% of that rate, we come up to 0.467. To minimize the volatility that Michael was talking about before, we would recommend that you would calculate the new rate in increments of 25. In other words, it would be 5, 4.75, 4.5, 4.25, et cetera, et cetera. So since the rate calculates at 467, we would bump it up to 475, again, to be conservative and to minimize the volatility. So that's formulaically how the calculation of the contribution rate would work under this scenario that we are presenting this morning. This would be reviewed annually, certainly in enough time for us to make the announcement that the authority is required to make by November 1st. If we can make it earlier, we can. I know that the payroll providers like to get as much time as they can, and we would also want enough time to get the word out to the employers and the payroll providers so they can be ready for the new contribution rate on January 1. The one thing I do want to add before I conclude, in case you're wondering, where do the increments of 25 come from? There is a federal precedent for that. At the federal government level, they do change rates at increments of 25. So that wasn't just some, number we decided to pick out because it was nice and neat. It is nice and neat, but there was a precedent before that at the federal level. So it seems to work for them and helps them change the rate in a tempered and modulated way, which is really what we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So all that was sort of laying the groundwork for the conversation today. Had we gone with option 2, we probably just would take everything Dave just said, write it down, and that's our policy. But we went with option 3, which is that middle ground. So I'm going to pull up the language that I had shared previously, which, by the way, I didn't mention this, I don't think, but we had been shared with Holly beforehand, so it already included her thoughts and changes. This version has some of the changes that Mike, you had shared yesterday. So I had highlighted the yellow parts because I think those are worth having a conversation about today. But before we sort of dive into any of the specific parts, just want to ask the committee, is there any additional changes that they would like to see? Either big picture, things we're not thinking about, we want to put in the policy, or, minor tweaks to language or the way it's written. And if not, we can sort of dive into the specific highlighted parts. But I'll take it that
Go ahead.
yeah. All right. So maybe we can talk about a few things. Mike, this is basically on your comments. The first section, we originally had shall begin as our language, and you had given a couple options. Anticipates beginning, aspires to begin. I also threw in aims to begin. It sounded like you were sort of looking for the right word that essentially, tell me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but gives a timeline, but doesn't necessarily hold us to that timeline that if we fail to meet it, all of a sudden we can't change the contribution rate. And so it's more of like setting a goal, a target goal at least, for when the conversation about the contribution rate would happen. So it's curious if the committee has preference for sort of which option, or is it a different way of phrasing it you'd like to see?
Well, anybody have any comments? I mean, looking at your options here, Mike, I like anticipates. We anticipate we're going to do this, and we will do it, but if it slips to July, if we began a month early, we're still okay.
Yeah, I actually like that option a lot. Versus aspires to begin makes it sound almost like it's you're you don't have a lot of control over it. Anticipates sort of is saying, well, there certainly could be, a lack of quorum or something else that would prevent it.
Right.
Sort of, it still is the goal, and the
Mhm.
goal is sort of in your hands.
Right. Anyone else?
I like anticipates. Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate in terms of what we're doing here. And shall begin is just a little bit too binding. So I think anticipates is good.
Okay, thanks, David.
I agree.
I agree as well.
All right.
Excellent. The second item was, Mike, you had removed following factors. I think this is probably just the writing style thing. I left it in just for the conversation. I like nouns. I like having sort of them included, particularly when it comes to policy language. So I don't feel strongly if we want to remove factors, but sort of I tend to write with that. I would have included a noun here. So I just wanted to open that up for a conversation. If people feel it's better to have it say the authority shall consider the following and then start the list, or consider the following factors.
All right.
So-
Well, I don't have any particular preference for nouns or verbs or adjectives.
I would say review the following considerations personally, just because factors is again kind of a binding term, whereas considerations is a little bit more fungible. So that's where I would land. But
I think that's fine. I mean, in the last bullet, we have evaluation of any other factors. I'm not quite sure there's a lot of substance to whether we go with factors, considerations, or neither. And that's my point.
yeah.
And we probably originally drafted this to say the authority shall consider the following considerations, and so probably we ended up with factors, so we didn't say consideration twice. But I do like David's suggestion.
Yeah.
Review
Yeah.
as the verb, so consideration can still be the noun.
All right. Anyone else? Everybody okay with considerations?
Nodding heads.
Excellent. So then the last item, Mike, you had asked a comment about, or asked a question about this. We had added a little bit more language here. I'm going to switch it to the track changes version. We added the need for, and rather than saying in the future, change it to due to economic conditions. But otherwise, your comment was just sort of, can we talk about this in the meeting? So I'm curious if you think those changes address your concerns, if you have other issues you would like to raise about that language, or just want to have a conversation about it. Happy to do so now.
Well, I think you addressed it in your earlier comment. I'm just looking here. Give me one moment. I think the word need is probably what I was focused on. Once we start talking about need, we leave open the possibility that somebody disagrees with our conclusion that there's a need. And we could make a change without, well, internally we would determine there's a need. So what if we said the statutory obligation to just deleted the need to limit contribution rate increases and reductions? One of the advantages we talked about, I mean, I think last month I asked, what's the advantages of having a policy versus no policy? And I think Aaron gave you gave a very good explanation. It shows the public, we've thought about it, there's transparency. Should somebody, for whatever reason, decide to challenge us, we could point to, this is what we did. And I think there's value in that. But one of the challenges could be, well, you really didn't need to. And if we eliminate the word need, I think we put ourselves in a better position.
I think that's fair. And I think even this language does still allow sort of flexibility for each individual person on what they, limit isn't a strict word. Limit could mean it never happens. Limit could mean it doesn't happen very often.
Mhm.
Each sort of person can interpret that their own way. So it still does give a lot of flexibility
Mhm.
for that.
Okay, anyone else? Any other thoughts?
Excellent.
you.
So I think next steps are, if the committee's okay with it, share this with the board. And we ask that it be posted for notice and comment in the board meeting next Thursday.
And Mike, just following that time frame, posted for notice and comment, assuming the board approves. That's 60 days, right? That brings us, I'm thinking, are we going to be in a position to use this in making the determination by November 1 that we need to make?
Yes, I think for one thing that helps is that we could have always used this policy even before it's officially adopted as sort of, your own internal review of what the contribution rate should be, because it's not sort of, countering anything in our statutes or countering any sort of current authority that I think that the board has. But yeah, from a timeline perspective, we should be on pace, assuming we post it this month. It's a 30-day notice and comment period, but because of the timing of our board meetings, it essentially would mean 2 months. So it would be the August board meeting where it could potentially be officially adopted once we've reviewed any comments from the public, which is enough time for it to be used for the November 1st date.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions or comments for Michael on that policy? Thanks so
and
much. Go ahead.
I'll just add that one of the reasons we wanted to encourage setting the policy or setting the contribution rate early is so that our stakeholders know what's going on. But by virtue of this very conversation, everybody knows what the options are. So I think we're still achieving that notice, even though the decision may not be made until September or October.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your work on that.
Thank you.
Moving on, Aaron, do you want to lead us in a discussion regarding reporting procedures?
So we trying to get to there we go. We have spent a lot of time this year just kind of shoring up some of our internal policies and procedures, making sure that they're sufficient and they're appropriate, particularly as the agency itself grows. And so one area that we've been talking about a fair amount internally from a best practices perspective, not from a we have a problem that we need to solve perspective. I just want to be clear. This is all very much about anticipating the future, not dealing with a current issue. One of the issues we've been talking about is, do we have appropriate language and mechanisms in place to make sure that we have a culture of transparency and that people who have concerns know how to report them so that they can be addressed. So we have some really good language already, but I think some of it could be improved. So just to share, with anything that's a discrimination, retaliation, kind of the EEO world, we've got a very robust policy in our handbook that goes into great detail about discrimination, harassment, and reporting of retaliation and reporting those complaints, and following sort of standard recommendations with regard to discrimination and retaliation issues. We offer a wide array of people that a person could bring a concern to: their supervisor, their manager, the CEO, the chairman, chairperson of the board of directors, our EEO rep from DAS, or HR rep from DAS. So, and then the policy goes into great detail about if you're a complainant, if you're a witness, if you're a supervisor or manager. But basically, there's a lot of people there. So that I feel like we're in good shape on this side. On the ethics policy, which is the next slide. We have an ethics policy, which provides guidance about sort of issues that relate to the state code of ethics. The language in the policy talks about sort of avoiding appearances of impropriety and says that if you have any questions about the ethics policy or any questions about sort of how any particular action or situation may interact with the policy, you can bring it to the CEO, the ethics liaison, your own supervisor or manager, or to Office of State Ethics. I will say, when we adopted this policy, I was the general counsel and the ethics liaison. We've now made Amber the ethics liaison. So as just part of our regular cleanup, we are going to add in general counsel just so that we have another person. But again, we have sort of a number of people available for our staff if they have any concerns. And we do direct them to the Office of State Ethics if they feel appropriate. Or what typically happens is we reach out to them ourselves. Then we have our open door policy, and I've quoted that in its entirety. It's pretty short. It is part of the employee handbook. It basically says, come to me if you have any problems, concerns, questions, or complaints. And if you don't want to come to me, you can go to our HR rep. And we list sort of a number of things that maybe might be an issue that you might want to come to us about. But it's pretty informal language. It really is sort of that message of, let us know if you've got an issue. So that's what we have right now. As we go through, now we're in our second round of audits with the auditors of public accounts, and we're just sort of thinking through, again, risks and concerns. Not that we have any real issue right now, but just trying to make sure we have the best possible policy. We've been thinking, should we add anything else to our language? There is a statute, it's the 4-33A statute. It's the one that sets out when an agency or quasi has to notify the auditors of public accounts when there's any unauthorized, illegal, irregular, or unsafe handling or expenditure of funds, breakdown, unsafe keeping, breach of security, or your awareness that someone's contemplating engaging one of those acts. If we become aware of that, we have an obligation to notify the auditors. So, question for the committee, do we think that that's something that we should put in our handbook somewhere, potentially as part of the open door policy or as its own standalone? Do we want to include a reference to the auditors of public accounts, like we reference Office of State Ethics? The Auditors of Public Accounts website has a great page where it sort of identifies things that you could report to them and gives people a process. Do we want to just create that flag post for our folks? Another thing we've been talking about internally is, do we add a designated board member to the open door policy? So instead of just saying CEO or HR, do we say CEO, HR, or a board member? And do we want to say any board member or a designated board member? Or are there other things that, in your experience, you think we should add? I will tell you, we've done a little bit of research. I'm just going to stop sharing so I can see you all. We've done a little bit of research, and other state agencies don't have like whistleblower policies or any sort of explicit language. So there's nothing that we can say, oh, this is the standard language in other state agencies. But, that doesn't mean we can't do better, and maybe we'll create a model for them. So that's the summary. I'm curious what you think.
All right, questions, comments? Well, I tell you, my view generally has always been to have as broad and welcoming I'll call it a complaint procedure as possible. The only thing I'm thinking about is that one paragraph where the agency has to report to the state auditors. Was that it? and there were 4 items, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Mhm.
The only thing I'm thinking about is, does it make sense to add those 4 items? You know, if you're aware of or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 reported to the agency. That's kind of the only thing I'm wondering about.
Yeah. It's sort of turning the 4-33 into
Yeah.
a directive.
Right, adding that to our policy, you know, for internal reporting. I mean, that
Yes.
would show kind of robust compliance, you know, effort to comply with 4-33.
Absolutely. I think that's a good suggestion.
And my other thought is, I would not say call any board member, because who knows where that would go? You know,
Yeah.
we may never hear about it.
Yeah.
Well, not to malign our board members, but what might be a complaint might not be considered a complaint or taken as seriously as we would otherwise take it.
I have to agree with you, just from my employment law background. The value of having multiple reporting mechanisms is it makes it easy. The risk is that it could end up with dead ends. And so you have to
Yeah.
balance that, both sides.
Yeah, well, then the question becomes, if we open the door to, or the complaint avenues to all those people, do we need to train those people on how to deal with complaints?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is it really necessary to add a board member at this point?
Again, I don't know that it's necessary per se, as much as it's a question for you all, if you think it's an appropriate extra step. You know, again, all of this is kind of above and beyond, but we just want to be, if there's a concern that people think, oh, it would be helpful to have another voice, you know, we can make it Michael as a general counsel.
Or you could even make it me if you want. I mean, I've certainly got enough employment law experience.
Hey, David, thank you. Try
Just
not
seems
to
like we shouldn't go
volunteer
past
board
the
members.
chair, though. To David, I liked your earlier point. I mean, you're trained and can handle it, but we don't want to create dead ends. We don't want to create, you know, little tornadoes of information off in corners. I think
Hmm.
having, if it's a board member, I think I'd suggest stopping at the chair, but I also am open to other things. But again, I think having it go too broadly creates a number of other concerns. But I think the transparency and you know, more is better in terms of telling people what the obligations and opportunities are for reporting.
Does everyone know who our human resource representative is? Do all these employees know?
Yes, so we do, they all meet, so our designated human resources person is Dr. Heidi Gray. She's got her PhD recently, so she's an amazing person. They all meet Heidi upon hire, but also this year we've made it an effort to make sure that both Heidi and our designated EEO rep, Alicia Nunez, come to some of our board meetings, not board meetings, our staff meetings, so that they have opportunities to kind of engage with the team. So I think our staff definitely know our HR folks.
Mhm.
I'm not concerned about that. We can certainly include Heidi and Alicia at a board meeting if the board would like to meet them. I'm happy to have them come to a future board meeting if that's a concern.
My sense is we have multiple options now. If there were a particular issue we were trying to address, if there were a shortcoming we identified, and we're looking to, you know, do better, then I'd be inclined to broaden it, but I don't feel the urgency to do that. I know what everyone else thinks.
I'm guessing silence is consent. Dangerous thing to assume, but okay, thank you for this. What we can do is, as you'll hear in a moment, we are looking at various policy, sort of the next 6 months worth of policy work. So we can add this in, and I think adding in the 433 language as a directive, and maybe adding the general counsel
Mhm.
may be appropriate for now, and then we can see if we need to do more as we go.
Okay, but I do appreciate David's offer. Thank you.
We might just call David on the side. Hey, David. I know David has a lot of compliance experience as well as employment law experience, so
Mhm.
definitely a valuable asset to the board.
Absolutely. Okay, shall we move on?
Yep.
To policy roadmap for the rest of the calendar year. Michael.
Absolutely. Thank you again. So this topic was just sort of to make sure the committee was aware. For anyone who was with the board, in 2020, 2021, I feel like policies were coming out all the time. It was sort of every month. And since, as I mentioned before, it sort of is a 2-month process at a minimum because of the public comment and official adoption. It was sort of, you had one policy 1 month and a totally different policy the next month. Then the first policy would come back the 3rd month. We had sort of gotten away from that, and policies had slowed down the revisions and the drafting of new ones. But I wanted to share this because we're going to sort of ratchet that up a little bit. So we've mentioned a few in this meeting. We obviously have the rate contribution rate policy that we'll ask the board to post for comment this month. Aaron had mentioned minor changes to the ethics policy, potentially the employee handbook. I'm going to share my screen again. We also had a few other anticipated policy changes. Some of these are essentially mandated because of the legislative changes that occurred on this past session. So, for example, the definition of municipality or the expansion of family violence leave to also cover sexual assault. Those are going to require changes to a few of our policies. And so this is sort of the timeline we have. But also, while we're making some changes, we're going to look to clean them up and make any sort of other enhancements we're looking for. So current expectation is I'm currently drafting changes to the consolidated policies right now. I hope to have those available for the committee in July and hopefully officially adopting in September. Those will incorporate the changes needed because of the Public Act 24-5. We previously referred to it before it passed as Senate Bill 222. We're also going to include a few other changes we had identified earlier in the year as needing more clarification on, including those municipalities or boards of education that can negotiate to participate via collective bargaining agreement. We're starting to get those coming in, so we want to make sure we have appropriate policies for them, as well as the sole proprietor, self-employed policies, which we just want to make sure they accurately reflect how we want the program to work for those individuals. And there's other changes that'll be part of that. So just as a preview, hopefully get that to you all next month. Similarly, the private plan policies and procedures will need to be updated, somewhat because of the statutory changes, but then also I referenced, I think it was back in January, additional changes such as allowing a little more flexibility to reduce their contribution rate if they need to, rather than having them hold on to money that they don't need for the program. We could potentially allow them to do that, even though it is a material change to their plan, as well as maybe having minor penalties for minor infractions as sort of a lesson learned from what's happened on the public side with our contributions, where if you go out with maybe $50 penalty, all of a sudden compliance starts to get better. Those we hope to have for the committee in August and hopefully have it officially adopted in October. 2 other policies that we have on the horizon that we know about: the employee handbook. Once again, there are a few things that need to change because of the legislative changes, but also that is probably due for a general refresh and review and refresh because it was last updated in December of 2021. So I think there's probably some other change we can make, as well as Aaron mentioned some regarding the ethics and reporting policies. Those, we don't have a specific month, but assume late summer, early fall. And then finally, finance and accounting manual that tends to be updated annually. So Dave's team's going to take a look at that, and we potentially will have that for the committee, similar time frame as the employee handbook. So a lot of things will be coming around. Mostly, I just wanted to make sure the committee was aware of what's going to be happening, but then also sort of, I know it's complicated. The authority folks will make sure that sort of we're level setting every time, so that if you don't feel confused, we're going to make sure we're on track. And you know, there's a lot of balls in the air, a lot of plate spinning, whatever metaphor you want to use, but I think we're in a good spot, and we'll make sure the committee is sort of aware of what's happening each month.
Okay,
Happy to
thank
take any
you.
questions.
Questions, comments for Michael? I just have one question. Obviously, when there's legislative changes that affect policies, they need to be changed.
Mhm.
Do we have a formal process for reviewing policies on some regular basis? The policies that are not affected by legislative changes?
A great question. Formal policy, no. We're trying to start one, basically. It's my goal to try and have all of our policies at least looked at once every 2 years.
Mhm.
I feel like that's a good cadence. We're sort of doing that, but it's not, we don't have like an official schedule for it. I'm working with you know, Stephanie and Amber on our team. We might come up with a more sort of formalized schedule, because I think that is the best outcome eventually, but we just haven't set it up yet.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on. Anyone want to raise any old business? Seeing none, anyone have any new business? Seeing none, then I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Abstentions? The meeting is adjourned. It is 9:44 a.m. Thank you for your time this morning. Have a
Thank you,
good day.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.